So hello everyone, and thank you for joining us in the second session of the day titled In Search for Knowledge Navigation, which is part of the Knowledge Online Forum COVID-19, Accelerating the Steps Towards the Knowledge Society that started yesterday and is continuing until tomorrow. And it's organized by the Knowledge Project, a strong partnership between UNDP and the Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum Knowledge Foundation. So before introducing the expert, let me first share with you the interpretation and Q&A guidelines. So this session will be fully conducted in English with Arabic interpretation being available. As such, if you wish to attend the session in Arabic, please choose the French language in the interpretation section, French, which is located next to the chat icon at the bottom of the screen. And for questions, please drop them in the Q&A box. Now I will repeat what I said in Arabic to make sure that everyone got the guidelines. مرحبا جميعا في هذه
Welcome all for this second session of our forum, the COVID-19 Accelerating the Steps Towards the Knowledge Society. This session will be in English, and interpretation into Arabic is available. You can click on the button interpretation, you put French button of your screen to choose your preferred channel, which is French in that case, which is Arabic.
Professor Emeritus Leif Edvinsson, who is joining us from Sweden. Leif is a pioneering contributor to the theory and practice of intellectual capital. He's the world's first director of intellectual capital back in 1991. And in 1998, he was named and awarded the Brain Trust Brain of the Year Award. And he is the co-founder and founding chairman of the New Club of Paris. Welcome, Leif. We are thrilled to have you join us today in this session and look forward to the insights and wisdom that you will be sharing with us. So, let me kick off this session with a question. So just to set the scene, and I'll give you the floor for 7 minutes to elaborate on it. And after that, we will take the questions from the audience. So Leif, do you think that countries that are excelling at both the economic and well-being levels, they possess hidden capabilities that allowed their citizens, their communities, and their governments to overcome the physical, the solid and rough physical environment? And what's the role, what role indeed will the intellectual capital, play in the new emerging future? Because as we know that the world before COVID-19 is not the same. And do you think should the world pause, reflect, and aim for a change in perspective, maybe moving from the financial and the tangibles to the intellectual and intangibles? Happy discussion, and over to you, Leif.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this event. And I'm very happy and honored to be there with you and your colleagues. And thank you to Hani Torki, as well as to the CEO of the MBRF Foundation. And he is actually referring to your question. I'm talking about His Excellency Jamal. He's saying we have to take a 7-generation perspective on your questions. So that will probably give a framework for our conversation. And I just wanted to give you a few minutes of introduction to stimulate your thinking. And as you know, there are 3 aspects of knowledge navigation that could be applied. One is position, the other one is direction, and the third is speed. And COVID-19 might have just given us another sailing direction. And this sailing direction will be elaborated as we proceed. But I think the option, which is in your question, Anthony, is what's the position of, for example, UAE, or for Sweden, or for United States? If you take the eminent statistics and reports of the Global Knowledge Index from UNDP, you have one map. That map should probably supplement it by other maps. And it could be the maps of New Club of Paris, which you find on the website of New Club of Paris, which is National Intellectual Capital, extended with sustainability, national intellectual capital issues. And then you might be seeing a very interesting little part of it, and that is that ICT is very good for UAE, but there is a gap. And the gap might be in life science. Who are the leaders in life science, and will they be sustainable leaders in life science? And that's where I think you also have the opportunity space for the future to look into the life science gap and re-paradigm. Because if you look at what's happening in UK, there is a very interesting work done on World Health Innovation Summit. And that is an effort to try to go from hospital to salutogenic care of citizens. So from hospital and staying in the bed or in the laboratory or the respiratory to go into a salutogenic citizen care. And that is another option besides the life science labs. And that takes us to a few more points. One is what's the direction for future? And that is in this picture that you just see. It is in the adjacent options. So we have to learn to see the close by or the adjacent opportunities. And that is, among others, very interesting if you look at Japan. Japan has started a Future Center Alliance, Japan with more than 50 future centers collaborating in a network. And this network is, of course, like the picture tells you, a collaboration between human beings with one finger from a man and one finger from another generation. And this is the cross-generational future center approach, which takes Japan as well as Sweden and other places to where do we find the wise places? If you take the map of UAE, where is the wise place of UAE? And is it the traditional shopping center or is it somewhere else? So that's why what's happening right now in Finland is that they're trying to reboot this societal map. And that should take us to the next final aspect of this. The way you can work with the speed is probably by finding knowledge alliances. You don't have to do everything yourself. So weave a network with other knowledge partners to speed up. And that is to go beyond the traditional gravity, which is in politics and other sectors. So as Anthony and I spoke about before we started, what's the sign of the future? The sign of the future might be in the sign of infinity, 2 zeros. And if you go into the quantum physics meaning of a zero, you see that that is the opportunity space to start to grow and look into it. And the way to look into the future is not forecasting. It's not forecasting, it's anticipation. And this anticipation that needs mind training like the Future Center or wise places or wise spaces that I just mentioned. So with that, I kick you off into a conversation, and I think you have a beautiful opportunity with a platform that you have created, but it should be supplemented with wise space, life science lab, cross-generational aspects, and not only 3 generations, but 7 generations, as Jamal is saying, and anticipate the future. Happy future, friends.
So thank you, Leif. So we are expecting your questions on the Q&A chat box. Meanwhile, Leif, you mentioned the opportunity space.
Yeah.
Can we say that we are could you confirm whether we are experiencing an expansion or a shrinking in the opportunity space, especially given the challenges that are not only, if you want, economic challenges. We witnessed for the first time, maybe my generation witnessed a health crisis that the world is incapable of doing so. We've got poverty, we're not on track. Maybe the SDGs, we're not 100% on track. So are we experiencing an expansion of this opportunity? Are we depleting our resources, whether they are intellectual or, if you want, more like the capital ones?
We are just jumping to another curve. And this was researched many years ago by J. Forrester at MIT. So the world dynamics is actually expanding, and the universe is expanding, and we are a little piece of it. But the traditional media is trying to create probably the wrong picture, like it's shrinking. Perhaps the traditional economy is shrinking, but you also see that the stock exchanges are growing tremendously. So the multiplication factor is actually giving us expanding space.
Okay, thank you. So I have a question. Could you please explain more and elaborate on when you mentioned the life science and the gaps, what do you exactly mean by the gaps?
The gap is where you could be or versus where you are. And this gap of opportunity is where you can start to elaborate and experiment with new options. And this will start a new curve for your development. So if you try to stay on the old curve, the rotation of the Earth will take you off course. You will drift off. And as you probably know, the speed of the rotation of the Earth is roughly 1,600 kilometers per hour. So you have to speed up into a new curve. And that will be the spaces of life science and health.
Thank you. So you mentioned a few minutes ago the traditional media and the role that it's playing, but I have a question. So do you think that this new curve that you mentioned is expanding? Don't you think it's expanding at the expense of the environment, maybe the less developed countries? So do you think this curve is taking into account all the factors, especially that in development, we just do not only concentrate on the economic aspect, but as well on the environmental and the societal and the well-being, especially that working with you lately, you always consider that the fifth industrial revolution will revolve around wisdom and the well-being of humans.
Yes, and that's why your work with the Global Knowledge Index is very good, because we need to develop new indicators to understand this expansion into a new space. And this is really knowledge navigation at the core of it. And it's not on the expense of the other one, because the other one will drift off anyway. So if you look into the life cycle curves that was presented by J. Forrester more than 50 years ago, you could see that the production of various items were going through these traditional life cycle curves. And you see it in the car industry, and you will probably also notice that one of the most affluent countries 800 years ago was Indonesia, but it's not today, but it's on its way. And you can also see that they have just launched solar-based boats for tourists, which will take away the pollution from the traditional boats and the ferries when you replace it with solar panels. And
But
the same will and the gap is where you are today versus where you will be tomorrow.
So we have a question from Dr. Nashwa Turki. She's saying that she believes that the world as a system is making a huge progress at the technical and the technological aspect, but still people, they need more rehabilitation to adopt the new world after COVID-19. So she's asking, what do you think?
Partially right, because it changed the rhythm for many people. They went to hospital, or they were locked up or locked down, whatever you call it. And that gave people time to reflect upon what's essential in life. And that might be what I just mentioned initially, that COVID-19 might have given us another sailing direction. And when you sail, you always change course, because that's a way to capture the wind. So it's the same right now, and we are probably going much more into the culture and the spirituality dimensions, or the mind shift of learning to use your mind.
We have another question. What do you mean by the sign of the future and the cat knowledge?
Did you say cat knowledge?
Yeah, the cat knowledge. Apparently, it's the one who joined us earlier today, but because we discussed the cat, especially it's on Leif's tie. So the leadership, the cat, and the significance of the cat in your models usually and in your discussions.
Yeah, if we start with a cat, you can command a dog, but it's very, very difficult to command a cat. And that's why the knowledge leadership is about how to navigate together with a cat and get the cat going where you think it should be going, which is very, very tricky. And it's the same with scientists and media people. They go their own way. And sometimes the right, sometimes the wrong one. I do think that we are on a rather interesting navigation with this COVID-19 impact, because we start to see that some nations like Estonia, they are becoming extremely oriented towards using the IT. So you have electronic citizenships, electronic passports, etc. We see that distance treatment of patients is also coming up as a very interesting opportunity. You don't need to go to the hospital because it might actually contaminate you if you go there as a patient. Instead, you're coming in through the digital media.
So do you think, Leif, that you always discussed beyond accounting for minds, and you speak about the wise place. Are they connected? Is there a linkage between them? Like, could you please set the scene on these two topics mainly, please?
Yes, the accounting is usually limited to financial accounting, and that is the least wise part of the future, actually, because the future is in the drivers for the financial accounting. So actually financial accounting is an outcome, while the leadership is to find the other indicators to navigate around. And we will see that the new maps will emerge, perhaps together with the MBRF and the Knowledge Foundation. I would be very happy to collaborate with you on the new mapping of society. And the nations that you just mentioned a few minutes ago are anticipating new approaches. And the old institutional framework is cracking. And that's why we have so many people who are at despair, because they are afraid of the future. But together we can actually give them confidence of the future.
Speaking about institutions, we have a question from Nawal. She mentioned that you discussed previously about the life science, which is an important sector, if you want, in a country. But she's asking, so in any country in the top leadership, who should be responsible for the life science, if you want, under which institution, maybe ministry, authority? How do you envisage its role as a public institution? To be efficient, definitely.
Very, very good question. And as you might recall, I was on the board for the Center for Molecular Medicine in Stockholm at Karolinska, and we went from a startup to more than 600 scientists in 10 years' time, and reached a global position of number 4 in the world. And the oversight or the governance of the life science institutions probably be in the Ministry of the Future.
I think it's really hard. I'm laughing because it's really hard in the Arab region to see the future. I think the future for us is definitely infinity and unattainable at the time being. But it's really interesting to know that we have there's a need for new ministries that are more comprehensive and inclusive. And I think COVID-19 should also stop us to revisit our institutions and ministries and to go beyond the traditional models. We have another question from Amani.
But before you proceed with the question, this was very, very good. It's a punchline you just touched upon. We should not go back to the COVID-infected old institutions. We should move on to new institutions. And that is called societal innovation.
Exactly, I totally agree. I'm just trying to take all the questions to make sure that we are covering all the aspects of this discussion.
Take the good ones.
I think all questions are good questions. I think that the answer should be also good. So she's asking if there's the need for a new indicator to deal with the morality issues. I think it's a very important point, and I think you will provide us with great insights on this point, because the values, the peace, justice, and liberty. So what could you tell us on this point, the morality issues?
The morality is extremely critical, and it is probably related to the vision of the future that you should share in between the people. So that's why many years ago I was involved in values analysis, and that was based on foundation values, transition values, and visionary values. And the most important for guiding us into the future is visionary values. And that has to be articulated. And that's where you have the catwalk to see, try to learn to see the new future. And this work can actually be achieved by looking into world
Leif, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So another question regarding the youth. Could you please amplify on the role of the youth in futurizing the intangibles? Do they have a role? Do you think the role on the youth is different or bigger than that on the government or on civil society or the private sector?
When I was active as a director, I initiated future teams. And those future teams were grouped in 3 generations: the senior people, the middle-aged, and the youngsters. And the youngsters were very, very creative together with the seniors. We had actually young and senior architects working together to design the future center. And it has to do with risk propensity. And this risk propensity is very low in the young age, but it's also very low in the senior age. So that's why they collaborate good. And we could see, for example, when I was sending out my future teams, after roughly 1 week, middle-aged people came back and asked, who will sign my travel order? Because they were afraid not to get paid for their travel expenses. But the youngsters and the seniors were already gone that after a week into the future, searching for new indicators and new options.
So a follow-up question to this topic, Ahmad Abul Khair, he's asking, indeed, we got used as all generations to have an example and path to follow. And now we are between 2 different lifestyles. How we can imagine our path and what we can follow? Can you have a guideline? Should we have, indeed, I will tweak the question. Should we have a guideline? Do you believe in the predetermined guidelines for the future, or we should be agile and flexible to accommodate with any occurring, if you want, a risk?
Well, it's probably a combination of it. You have to be agile, but you should not be agile on the expense of somebody else. And that is the ethical dimension of it. You should not, so to say, consume other people's space.
Mm-hmm. Another question. another question, Leif. The role of entrepreneurs, maybe. What's the role of the emerging entrepreneurs for the future? What do you think, like, if you could list for us some set of skills that entrepreneurs should possess to be able to move from the traditional school to futurizing the intangibles and changing their accounting methods, maybe moving from only credit debit into a new approach?
This is also a very good question. And the meaning of entrepreneurship is actually to be acting in the space in between. And it's French, entre, which means in between, and prendre, to take. So you take the space in between, or the new space. And as we know that only 4% of the universe is discovered yet, we have 96% to discover. And who will, so to say, assemble the new ship to go into the 96%. And that takes courage, it takes wisdom, it takes experiments, and it also takes mantling or redesign of societal rules to allow that. And that's why societal innovation is so important. And we started to ask the question about intellectual property. And intellectual property is a part of the legally protected knowledge. But as you probably also immediately realize that only a small fraction of the knowledge is legally protected. It's a free floating amount of energy. And sometimes it's called knowledge recipes. Sometimes it's called intangible assets. And the new trade is actually going to be not in intellectual property. It's going to be intellectual assets or intangible assets. So we see already in statistics drift off from trade of goods to trade to services to trade into intangible assets. And I have a book coming out on that in November.
Looking forward.
The new trade flow.
So on the trade flow, but before, please, Amir, because you repeated your question, could you please rephrase it? Because it's not clear for us. I have another question for you regarding the trade flow, the globalization. Do you think that the COVID-19, if you want, forced us to rethink the forces of globalization? Do you think that indeed globalization, was it a reality or a myth? If it's better for you, is it a reality, the globalization?
And it will be even more. You can see that COVID-19 was an impact of globalization. Without globalization, we wouldn't have COVID-19, but it's then the recipe to reduce the globalization, or it's the recipe to work with life science and new types of vaccine and then new types of innovative healthcare.
Are countries cooperating on this? Sorry to interrupt you, but this is my question exactly. The COVID-19, which is a negative to a certain extent, negative impact, but today want to be positive about it. Due to globalization, the widespread of COVID-19, but at the same time, when they are finding a solution, we see countries not cooperating, they are competing. Is competition, which is part of globalization, did it have a positive or negative implications on the solutions and partnerships?
Competition is from a kind of national economics viewpoint, usually reducing the common utility, because you are using the energy to fight each other instead of collaborating. So therefore, we need to find new platforms, new institutions. And you can see that with Spotify. Spotify actually changed the whole flow of music in the world, but it's based on innovation among legal contracts instead of just trying to hook it up. So it's a very interesting legal infrastructure in Spotify for sharing music. If we can do it with music, we should be able to do it with vaccine as well.
We have an interesting question from Iyad. He said, being positive with COVID-19, I would avoid positive in this context. And his question is, how can we define the line, if any, between what is ethical and what is not when it comes to futurizing? And he gave an example, Elon Musk's Neuralink, which is developing ultra-high bandwidth brain-machine interfaces to connect humans and computers.
And this is precisely the point, that you have to have the sharing dimension. And the sharing dimension should not stop with sharing for yourself. It should be sharing for the next 7 generations, like Jamal has been pointing out in our conversations, which is very, very interesting. What are you doing today to the benefit of your grandkids 7 generations down the road? And that is building society.
That's interesting. We have another question from Abir, which is also, I think, which is interesting. So because you're speaking about the future and the intangibles, what do you think about the Emirati lifestyle before and after COVID? What changed and what is a role model? So she's being specific to the UAE. Do you think the lifestyle will change? If yes, how?
Well, first of all, you will probably wash your hands better, because it has an impact on the health. That's a very tangible first step, actually. Hygienic factors, it's called in culture. The other one is probably that you have already so much in your heritage that you might be able to bring forward. And I've been given some books from Jamal and Wes, Harry, and it's very, very interesting to start to compare the culture of the Scandinavian countries and Middle East. Of course, it's a challenging part of it, but the beauty of it is we have to be sharing with other people, other citizens. And that's why they, among others in Finland, are working with rebooting society.
That's interesting. Another question, which will lead us to the gamification in education. If you want, Dr. Nashwa Turki is sharing her experience that they are facing. I think it applies to the Arab region, many problems when we take learning online as a solution for COVID-19, related to honesty and emotion and social behavior between teachers and their students. So again, the relation and the bonding, if you want, between now between teachers and students, and what is the role of gamification in this problem?
If we start with the gamification is actually the joy of playing with what you don't know that you don't know. And it might have also, it's not a casino, it's actually a learning and a good relationship with other people. And if you take the school, you might think about and see the school as a delivery channel, a way of distributing knowledge. And that was, among others, in Sweden. In 1842, we got a new law in Sweden saying that all the kids should go to school and not work on the fields together with their parents, because that raised the knowledge level of all people in society. But that was 1842. What should be the new lawmaking for schooling? And it is probably not the internet. It's something smarter. And that's why we have to work with the wise places and the smart society, which has already started. So it might be that the traditional teacher is going to be like the old farmers or the old fishing men. It's a new system emerging, and there will be a new role for teachers and professors.
So, Amani, could you please comment on the words of Donald Favaro? How can politicians and practitioners benefit from and build such a philosophic words? In other words, can we translate it into action given the greediness of our politicians?
Oh, yes. And that is what happened, among others, in Finland. When they had a crisis in their trade and well-being with Soviet Union. Everything collapsed. So they had to restart the whole society, and they formed a committee for the future. And this committee for the future was under leadership of a guy called Marco Marcola. And he did a remarkable job, actually, across traditional political barriers, across institutions, and laid the new map for taking action in Finland. And that was the Committee for the Future. And Marco Marcola was later on promoted to become chairman for the Committee of Regions in Europe. And now he's retired. So you can invite him to November.
It would be too challenging for us having two great minds. Another question that will take us to big data from Majdi Ali. Sorry, but we're moving with the questions. We're trying to combine questions because there's too many questions here. How could big data contribute to the prediction of epidemics and pandemics, and also to combat them? But before, are you a strong believer in the power of big data? And do you think that big data, speaking of which, substitutes the traditional databases or complements them, and to what extent?
It's supplementary. You need a certain amount of data to see a pattern. Otherwise, the pattern will be not representative. So big data, but I'm more interested in smart data than big data. And smart data might help you to navigate. And as you know, the spaceship up there above us right now is using big data or data mining to be able to come back to the Earth. And it's the same for us. We need the new data. And MBRF is on the track with the knowledge index. And
how about NCP?
Yeah, NCP is also, but it looks like we could combine it into a new map.
We have a question, which sectors of the economy are likely to recover the fastest? And which ones will won't due to the new normal? And I think this question also taps on the jobs also and skills. We will see jobs that will no longer exist at a faster rate. We know that many studies, they told us that some jobs are in danger, but do you think all the analysis that has been done previously needs to be reconsidered, especially with the new normal?
Oh yes, I think the new jobs that will have the sustainability are so-called brain economy jobs. But we also will have very simple jobs like hair cutting. So when you go to a haircut, regardless of where you are in the world, it has to be done. It's very difficult to do it with digital or robots. They have already tried it, but they took too much with the robots, more than the hair actually. And you probably don't like that. So you want to keep your head. And that's why brain economics is the next part of it. It's intellectual capital.
Or uncovered?
Yes. Yes. Look at my hair.
It seems uncovered heads are better than those who are covered like mine. Let's move to an interesting question here from Amal Haidar. Now that we all feel the shift of energy and pattern due to COVID-19, what are some of the things we should unlearn and relearn in this period of time to prepare for future consequences, whether it's mentally, financially, or emotionally, or etc.?
Well, it's probably that travel is going to be impacted a lot, but we also need to travel in a smarter way. So that's why travel to school and commuting will also change. And people are going to be connected in a different way through the technologies. But we need to learn to go from contactivity, where you connect the wires, to connectivity of the hearts and the feelings and the intangibles. And that might lead us to a smarter society. But that also needs anticipation.
So there's an interesting question here from Dr. Amir. There is a wisdom that says we must know where we are going, not where we are going. From your point of view, where the future is heading after the crisis toppled all the plans that the countries had for the future?
Yes, and that's why the role of looking into the future is not to make a forecast of what has been, but to anticipate the new drivers and the impact of those drivers. And my reading of it is that we are going to see much more demand for life science of various types, but that also takes us to the food science. If you look at the situation in UAE, for example, you have a lot of diabetes, and diabetes is based on sugar. So therefore we have to change the whole paradigm of sweetening our food.
So I'll take one more question before ending this discussion. It's always insightful and informative talking to Professor Leif. I'm thrilled and happy to be taking part of the session. I will have to choose one question. Okay, I'll ask the question. I'm sorry. I will take the question here. You mentioned the direction, the speed, and the velocity. I have a concern as a individual living in a country like Lebanon, where we are considered as developing countries and we are lagging behind. I think we are moving at a huge speed, but moving backward. My concern is, do you think that the direction, the speed, and the velocity of the developed countries and the leading countries is going in an opposite way than the least developed countries, and by that we will have a more by that will not be narrowing the gap, but indeed broadening it, and we will reach a place where we will not be able to control this gap?
It's probably impossible to control the gap. And that's why the metaphor of sailing is interesting. You have to have a certain velocity, as you said, or speed to avoid the gravitation and drifting off, because the tide of the water might take you into totally the wrong direction unless you are ahead of the tide. And that's why we probably have to discover the tide in politics as well. And the tide in politics is still only observed very, very critically in news media, but we could do it wiser. And that's why we need a wise place for wiser navigating our society to the benefit, not to me, not to you, but to the next generation.
So the final remark and question, the Global Knowledge Index, as you mentioned, as a knowledge navigation indicator, and the Future of Knowledge report, they concluded in 2019 that no country is ready for the future, not even the leading countries. And it concluded that countries are lagging in the research, development, and innovation, and more effort is required in terms of cooperation, funding, and partnership. But the question is, you mentioned that countries now will revisit travel. But my question to you is, as a futuristic person, didn't the world and policymakers and citizens know that travel, as we used to do it, it was harming and it was at the expense of another factor, which is the environment and climate change? Why do we need like COVID-19 to tell us, okay, hey guys, stop, watch out, we need to revisit travel? Isn't climate change enough?
Very good observation. I think we probably need to travel to get in touch with other people. A lot of things can go on through the net. But if I ask you, what's the smell of the future? What do you say?
Could you please repeat, sorry?
What's the smell of the future?
I will not. For me, it's negative. So just assume any negative term, it works.
And that's why we have started a project in Holland, in Netherlands, in Utrecht, together with the Future Center of the Rijkswaterstaat there, on futuristic mapping, positive mapping, because we discovered that there is a lot of young people in Holland and other places, like you just mentioned, with a kind of pessimistic view on the future. And that's why we have been distorted in our brains. And this was also discovered by some other researchers, that we need to see the right indicators, not the fake news indicators.
And this is why, yeah, sorry.
And that needs big data probably.
And that's why, as a knowledge project, and as I mentioned, a strong partnership which is robust and has a vision between the UNDP and the Mohammed bin Rashid Knowledge Foundation, decided to organize a series of webinars that started yesterday. The first workshop, not webinar, and the first workshop is tapping on moving from data to knowledge and then to wisdom, and then motivating and stimulating people to take action. Thank you so much, Dr. Leif. I'm really happy to have joined you in this discussion, which is for me always insightful and informative. And I would encourage everyone to check the 2020 book by Leif Edvinsson on the intangible asset gap in global competitiveness, mapping and responding to the new economy. One
little question for you before we finish. Can you type down the questions in a kind of one-page paper, if it's possible, and share it with the audience as well as me?
The questions, you mean the ones we discussed in this session?
Yes, yes.
We'll sure do.
Very good questions. Thank you so much for governing the dialogue.
Thank you, Leif. Thank you, everyone. See you soon in the Knowledge Summit with Professor Leif, definitely. Have a nice day.
Happy future.
Happy moment. We do not guarantee the future here in Beirut. Bye.